Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. Good evening. I'm happy to have another reading, another day of class with you. Okay. So we are now discussing John Stuart Mill, on free speech. Part of why we're doing this is in order to show you how philosophy operates and some of the value of doing philosophy. I know a lot of students come into philosophy not really entirely sure what it does. It's not like there's a lot of philosophers as, characters on TV anymore. You've got all these lawyer shows, cop shows, doctor shows. You get an idea of what they do. Some of your parents are lawyers, cops, doctors, etc. But not everyone knows a philosopher, and we don't see it all the time in the media. So maybe a little curious about what philosophy does. Or maybe you know exactly what philosophy does, but you're skeptical that it's actually something valuable. You might just think it's something abstract or useless. So this is why we're doing this Mill reading. A lot of people do this reading, and the first time they do it, they get one takeaway point from Mill. They say, okay, pages and pages, but all he's saying is that we should have the right to free speech. We should be able to say what we think, and the government can't prevent us from saying what we think. Now, that's totally true. That's exactly part of what Mill says here. But for one thing, he says quite a bit more than that. And second, backtracking to the point I made before, what he says that's more than is also going to show us what some of the value is of philosophy. So some people will say about philosophy, they say philosophers, they just talk and talk and talk. They take an issue that doesn't much matter, or they take an issue that matters, but one that we already know the truth about, and they just talk and talk and talk it into the ground. I've had my coffee today, so I'm ready to talk and talk and talk anything into the ground. Part of what Mill says is, you have the right to free speech. It is a right which the government should not infringe upon. That's the easy part. The harder, more subtle part that I trust that you all are going to develop out of the reading and understand is that he says it's not only that you have the right to free speech, it's that you should talk about everything. You should discuss all things, and it will benefit you if you do. Okay? So like I said, first point that people get is right there in the beginning of it, and it's a point that they already sort of know in their gut, is that people ought to have the right to free speech. The subtler point, the more interesting point, and the one that not everyone already has right in their gut, so that's why we're reading this, is that it is beneficial to discuss all ideas. Okay? All ideas are beneficial if we discuss them. Now you see that's a totally different point than the government should not prevent your speech. He's saying that you personally will benefit from discussing any and all ideas that come your way. Right? One idea is about what the government should not do. The government should not restrict your free speech. The other one's about how free speech can benefit you personally. As I said, the point here is not so much what did Mill say, but what is the value of philosophy? What's the point of doing philosophy? So I would say the value of free speech is going to be, the value of philosophy. Some of the value of doing philosophy is going to be found in the details he provides about the value of free speech. Okay. So something I want you to notice. This is a bit of a philosophical technique. Getting good at this philosophical technique will get you to be really sharp in conversations and reading, I'm sure you're already very sharp in conversations and reading, but it'll help you be even sharper. You will notice things that other people don't notice. You will understand things that other people could understand, but it just slips under the radar for them. Remember what I just said? I said Mill says two different things. One, the government ought not to infringe on your right to free speech. Two, it's beneficial for you to discuss each and every idea you can possibly get your hands on. Okay? So this second idea, that it will benefit you if you discuss every possible idea, actually has three different ideas or three different parts built into it. Okay? So he's saying that all ideas should be discussed. Okay? What he means there by should is that it'll benefit you if you discuss them. Okay? Now he's also saying that all ideas should be discussed. Okay? He doesn't just mean that you should talk about your favorite sports team, or I don't know, the Kardashians are still pretty famous, but there's probably someone more famous today right now, but you know, not just discuss those sort of things. Gossip about your friends, complain about politics, right? But all ideas, every idea is worth talking about. That's the second point. Okay. The third point built into this idea is that these ideas should be discussed. They should be talked about. They should be wrangled over with other people. Okay, so I'll say that again. There's three parts to this idea that you will benefit if you discuss all possible ideas. One of them is that all ideas, not just some common pop culture topics, but all ideas are worthy of talking about. The second point is that they should be talked about, not just thought or believed in your heart, but spoken out loud to others, and then you listen to their response. Okay. The third aspect is that you should talk about them. You ought to. You will benefit if you talk about them. Okay. So I'll go over this just one more time. If you've got it already, that's great, but I'm trying to make I'm making a complicated three-part point out of another point, and that can be a little hard to see what I'm doing at first. So once more, this idea in Mill that you will benefit if you discuss every single idea you can get your hands on is actually three ideas in one idea, or at least has three parts. First part is he's saying every idea, even ones that seem obviously true or false, every idea should be discussed. Every idea is open season. Second one is that he says they should be talked about. Not just that you have the right to free speech and the government can't burn your books, or that you can think whatever you want, but that you can say whatever you want. You got to say it out loud, loud and proud. Third point is not just that he thinks you can do this, but you should. You'll benefit. We will all benefit if we actually talk about these things. So again, all ideas is one part. Talking about them, actually speaking with others about them, is the second part. And third, that there are benefits to doing this. Three different parts to one idea. I just want to point this out because it's very easy, or it happens very often that we will read something difficult like this reading. I know the Mill is not the easiest reading to understand. And there's so much in there. There's so many interesting, controversial claims in there. There's so much specific evidence offered up for exact claims that it's easy to just sort of, or it's common to just skim over it and get some of the key points. Oh, he's saying the government shouldn't boss me around. Oh, Mill's a genius. I agree. But there's always, in our readings, there's always more going on. There's subtlety. There's incredibly weird things going on, incredibly interesting things. And sometimes there's a phrase that might make your life or shake up your life if you just let the details, if you read closely for the details. That's all. Just pointing out that, if you listen to a great song, You listen to it over and over again and you love it. And then you go back and you listen to it again and you're like, wait a second. There's even more going on in this song than I realized the first 50 times. Right? Whoa, the lyrics are even better than I thought. Or you're in love with someone, you know them really well, and then one day you just look at them slightly differently and you go, my God, they're so XYZ, they're so such and such. Oh, I'd never noticed it before. It was there the whole time. And even in my appreciation, I didn't yet appreciate this other detail. Well, great music, great people, and great writing is the same way. When I go back and I slowly reread this Mill every time I teach it, I pick out new things. I pick out new evidence for and support for what he's saying. I see new connections to other ideas and values that I've developed since I read him last. I find great new quotes. And I see things that are funny in it. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. But you see different things. I'm not asking you to reread this 20 times like I probably have. I am asking you, though, with this, with our readings, if ever they seem boring or not relevant to your life, or you just don't see what the point is, ask me, because there's tons of details. Whatever your interests are, there's something in here, snuck in there, hidden somewhere, like an Easter egg, that will be tremendously valuable to you. So if you read slowly and or you ask me about the readings, I can find something in here that you will love, that you will find interesting. It's in there. And once more, the proof I offer for that is that not only do many people, when they read this, miss his real point. It's not his main point that the government shouldn't boss you around. That's a secondary point. The main point are the benefits that come when you yourself try to discuss every idea you possibly can. That's his real point. So people often miss that. Then what I was pointing out is even that main idea actually has 3 totally different aspects to it. So everything's more complicated than it seems, more interesting than it seems at bottom, or at first glance. So now we'll get into the real focus, at least for our class. Okay, what's the benefit from talking about things that he alleges here? Okay. He says this on page 232, the first page. He says, there's a peculiar evil when you silence the expression of an opinion. You rob the human race, posterity, the future, as well as the existing generation. Okay? You rob the entire human race when you don't talk about something. And he says, again, a detail which is quite interesting. He says, those who believe an idea benefit from it being discussed. Those who disagree with an idea still benefit from it being discussed. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that sort of counterintuitive? Of course it would benefit, say Catholics to have Catholic ideas discussed in public. But what he's saying is even if you disagree or you're not Catholic, it benefits you to be exposed to their ideas. Please keep this in mind next time you're reading politics or about how other Americans supposedly are online. You don't want to read just your own views, echo chamber, bubble again and again and again. You want to be exposed to how the other half views the world, because even in disagreeing, you will benefit from hearing their dissenting ideas. I think that's an interesting, counterintuitive, very philosophical idea. So Mill does something very philosophy-y, I guess you could say, right at the very beginning. He says, we're going to talk about why talking about all ideas is beneficial. And he says, but all ideas, that's really general. Let's break it up into 2 different parts. We'll talk about why discussing true ideas is beneficial, and we'll talk about counterintuitive, controversial, Why even talking about false ideas, letting the wrong person have their say, why even that's valuable. So this is a very philosophy thing to do. If you want an answer to a big or tough question, one of the ways philosophy does that is it will break down the question into sub-parts that are just a little easier to handle. Okay? So he says we're going to talk about ideas, the value of ideas. That's a pretty big topic. So he says let's take it in bite-sized morsels. Let's take it in chunks that we can easily handle. First, we'll talk about ideas which seem to be false, why we benefit even from talking about them. Then we'll talk about ideas that are true and why it's even important to talk about them. Okay, so you'll often see this in philosophy, where we divide things up as soon as we can, so that we can, let's put it this way. When we're talking about big or controversial ideas, if you try to do too much at once, you'll just be unclear to your audience. They won't understand you. You won't convince them, and they'll lose interest. But if you can break things up into smaller chunks, you'll be more convincing and more clear. Okay? So, for instance, if you want to talk about crime, pretty important, right? If you just start talking about crime has gone up, well, what kinds of crime are you talking about? Violent crime, nonviolent crime? Or do you mean globally, locally, at the national level? Are you talking about crimes committed by adults or crimes committed by minors? You see what I mean? If you really want to tackle a subject, it's easier for you and more convincing to others if you can sort of break it up into different chunks first. Tackle one at a time. So I just want to point out that that's happening here, and then point out that it's a common philosophy method, breaking a tough question into smaller sub-questions that might be a little easier to explain. Okay. His first main point is pretty straightforward. I will say what he says, just to be clear, but I won't dwell on it. He says, anytime you refuse to hear an opinion because you know it's false, okay, what you're assuming is that your certainty that the thing is false is the same as absolute certainty. Okay? What he says, when you refuse to hear an idea because you think it's false, you're assuming that your presumption that it's false is a guarantee that it's false. It's possible that this individual idea is false, but it's not likely that every idea you think is false is as dumb and useless as you think it is. That's all. He's saying you should hear out an idea even if it seems false, because you've been wrong before, I've been wrong before. Maybe there's something to it. Just give it a chance, hear it out. That's all. The technical language he uses there is fallibility. To be fallible means you can make mistakes. And he says, if you refuse to hear ideas because you think they're false, you are assuming that you are infallible, that you have never been wrong, that it's impossible for you to be wrong. That seems a bit arrogant and unlikely, so just hear them out. Now he goes on the next page, and he adds a little more to this. He says, I know you think you're right, and probably most of the time you are right. But since you're not infallible, that is, you can sometimes make a mistake, you really want to hear ideas, even ideas that you think are false, because ideas are guides for action. Okay? He says, when you assume something's truth, you justify it for the purpose of action. Okay? So if you are wrong, if you are fallible, and you act on your false idea because you refuse to hear another idea, it will screw up your actions. It will misguide you. That's all. Relatively straightforward point. You could be wrong about thinking that someone else is wrong, so just hear them out. Give them a little platform and hear them out. And if you're wrong in thinking that they're wrong, since ideas are guides for action, you will have a bad guide, like a bad map, misleading you. The second point is a different point. It sort of extends this point, but I just want you to know again, if we're going to break things up into the smallest chunks we can, that this is a different chunk. It's a different point. This is the section called corrigibility. I know these old terms are annoying. When something's corrigible, it's just correctable. It's the same word, basically, the same ancient root, so the same etymology behind these words. That's why they share similar letters. Corrigible, correctable, they're basically the same word. So when someone's incorrigible, it means they cannot be corrected in their behavior. That's all. Okay, so this is page 233, and he says, human beings are mostly right about stuff most of the time. And he says, think about how far we have come. We used to not understand the phases of the moon, excuse me, which screwed up sailing. We used to not understand how plants grew, which screwed up food. All this stuff. But he says, look how far we've come. He says, this is the great thing about human minds. He says, it's a quality of human minds that's the source of everything respectable in us. Okay? And he says, this quality is that our mistakes are fixable. Our errors are corrigible, correctable. We can rectify our mistakes. So, how do you think people figured out how the phases of the moon really worked? How do you think people figured out how plants really work? By talking about it, by arguing and disputing and comparing ideas and testing them against each other in the marketplace of ideas. These ideas about the truth of the world, how to control it and how to act effectively in it, don't just come to people when they're lying in bed like some vision from nowhere. They talk with people. They fix what doesn't work in their ideas by talking with other people and learning from them. So this is what Mill says. He says, human errors and mistakes can be rectified, corrected, fixed. How are they corrected and fixed? By discussion and experience, not by experience alone. End quote. Okay? A little further below, he says, wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, to discussion. But facts and arguments, to produce any effect on us, must be brought in front of us. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments, arguments, discussion to bring out their meaning. End quote. So he goes on to say, if you trust someone's judgment, if there's someone you're like, man, this person always, they see what others don't. They know how to make the right decision. They just are on the ball. He says, this is the kind of person who, he says, has corrected their mind. They weren't born with wisdom about all these things. They allowed their mind to be corrected when they were wrong. Okay? And he says, how do we set right our mind when we're wrong about something? He says, you have to first keep your mind open to criticism of your opinions and conduct. That is, you have to listen to other people's views, even if you think you're right. Okay? He says, you will profit by listening to others, by letting them expound their views to you. By hearing, quote, every variety of opinion, studying all modes in which an issue can be looked at by every character of mind. Okay? And he says, the kind of person whose judgment you most trust, whether it's one of your parents or one of your friends, again, this person who just seems to always get it a little better than other people, he says that he bets, quote, that person has sought for objections and difficulties instead of avoiding them, end quote. That they learned through experience, that they learned through hard knocks and mistakes, and that's how they came to know so much. The flip side is that the only way you can learn from your mistakes is by listening to people who have different views from you. If they believe the same things you do, any possible mistakes that you have won't be corrected, but will be reinforced. it'll just double down on that mistake. But if your mind is opening to listening to everybody, including those who you think are wrong, if you listen to someone who thinks the opposite of you, then every time you're wrong, you're listening to someone who has the truth, right? Let's say you're only wrong in 1 in 100 of your ideas you have. Could be. If you're willing to listen to someone who thinks the opposite of every one of your ideas, then you're listening to someone who has the opposite of your false idea. So you'll be listening to someone who has a true idea where you don't. Right? That's the fix. That's how you correct or fix misunderstandings. Okay, just a little bit more here. Go on to the next page, page 234. Mill says, okay, we're passing to our second division, the second chunk of our discussion or argumentation. He says, before we were talking about why you should listen to ideas even if you think they're false. Now we're passing on to why you should listen to ideas even if you know that they're true, why you should still discuss and talk about them. Again, what he said before, listen to ideas even when they seem false first, because nobody's infallible. That is, we all make mistakes. So listen to something even when you, quote, know, end quote, that it's false, because you might be wrong. Second point is, when you're wrong, the only way you're going to realize that and fix it is by listening to people with other views. Those were the two parts to the first chunk, why you should listen to ideas even if they seem false. Second part now, he says, why should you listen to ideas even if you think they're true? Even if you already believe them. I love this line. He says, it's right before where that blank spot is. He says, however true an idea you have is, if it's not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, you can only hold it as a dead dogma, not a living truth. Okay? His point here is this. Whatever your religion is, whatever your ethical, moral beliefs are, if you don't discuss them, it'll slowly ossify and turn to stone. It will die. You'll still believe it, but what you will carry around with you instead of a living truth that really animates your behavior, that really guides your life, it's basically like you're carrying around a fossil. Not something alive anymore, but something that's turned to a heavy, dead weight. Sure, you're faithful to it. You drag around this rock everywhere you go, but it's not alive anymore. It doesn't do anything for you anymore. Okay, related points go on here. He says, if you believe something, even if it's true, and just to backtrack a little bit, we are doing this reading to show some of the value of philosophy. One of the things philosophy does is it talks about things other people don't talk about. It talks about religion and politics, right? Things that other people say, no, I don't want to fight. I don't want to dispute. Just leave me to my own opinion. But philosophy says, no, we have to talk about these things. We have to. If all of us agree, let's talk about it and learn more about it. If we disagree, let's see if there's anything we missed in our own view that maybe your view has. Okay, so philosophy agrees with Mill. All ideas, every possible idea, should be discussed with as many people as possible, every angle conceivable, and it benefits us to do so. Okay? One of the things Mill says here, which sort of links to what I just said about philosophy in general, is he says, if you believe a true idea, but you only believe it, and you remain faithful to it, but you don't discuss it with other people, it will die on the vine. Flipping that into praise of philosophy here is that even if you know something to be true or need it to be true for your life, you should still talk about it with other people, because if you don't, you will believe it, but it'll become taken for granted, it'll become distant, Or it will be, as he says on the right-hand side of page 234, he says, instead of a vivid conception and a living belief, there will remain only a few phrases retained by rote memorization. If you retain any part of it, it'll be the shell and the husk. Okay, he says further down, he says it'll lose its vitality, it'll lose its undiminished strength, that you need a struggle to make an idea really important to you. So, remember that I've said already, describing what philosophy is that it tries to back up or support its opinions and views. It never just says what it feels, but it tries to back up and support its views with some kind of evidence. Mill here gives some evidence, and I'll give you some evidence of my own. Because the goal is not to just say, Mill says that ideas which are left undiscussed, ideas which don't get philosophically discussed, they die. Well, I don't care what Mill thinks unless he shows me proof or evidence. So I will show you his proof or evidence, and I'll offer a little bit more of my own. He points out as evidence something which you see happen throughout history. The first believers of a new idea are fanatical. They are in love with this idea. They're willing to die for this idea, and they talk about it all the time. Think about the history of the early Christian church. I know that's something some of you will be familiar with. Who do you think was more passionately Christian? One of the apostles, or just some random Christian today that you just pick off the streets? I'd say probably Jesus and the apostles were more passionately Christians than today. They talked about it, they thought about it, they expanded what they knew about it constantly. Most, and again, this doesn't apply just to Christians, this applies to anybody. Notice how he doesn't say Christianity in his example, he just says doctrines, religious creeds, etc. I'm just giving some content so it'll make sense. Okay? The early adopters, right? The early adopters of a new genre of music, the early adopters of a video game or a comic book, they are ride or die, they live for this, and they talk about it all the time. Later on, it just becomes something that people pick up and they go, oh, that was a pretty cool movie. Oh yeah, Marvel Universe, pretty cool. And it doesn't move them. It doesn't mean as much to them. And they watch it and they're done. They don't talk about it. Okay? So that's his example, is that the early adopters of any moral or religious perspective are almost always more into it and more fanatical. And that's partly because they have to talk about it all the time because it's brand new. They have to defend it in public to people who think it's strange or wrong. Remember, early Christianity was condemned. Every new religion is condemned in its early days. And so he says they love the idea more, they understand it better, and they live it more fully because they're talking about it all the time. His point for today is that if you don't talk about your religion because you don't want to get in an argument, or you don't talk about your politics with people who disagree with you, you will believe, but what you believe will die and wither on the vine. You can't be passionate about something if you don't think and talk about it regularly, if you don't defend it and struggle for it. My own evidence and support is this. Because remember, Mill and I are asking you here to talk with everyone you can, no matter if they agree or disagree with you, about every idea you have. That's asking a lot. So we're offering evidence and support, because if I'm asking you to do something so big and not telling you any good reason to do it, I'd expect you to tell me to go hang, right? Why would you listen to me? But if we're asking you to do something big but giving you some good reasons for it, maybe you'll want to do it. So my example is this. You may have the 10 Commandments or whatever the moral code of your religion is memorized. You may have, if someone has an argument about abortion, whatever side you're on, you may be able to rattle off all your political reasons, left or right. Rattle them off because you got them memorized. Okay? Do you remember earlier in school when there's certain things you'd have to learn, like history in grammar school, in grade school, where just memorize it. Just memorize when the Declaration was signed. Memorize who signed it. Memorize the 13 colonies, etc. Don't you hate it when you only are asked to know something by memorizing it? Right? What he is saying here is, even if you believe a true idea, if you stop talking about it, it degrades into rote memorization. You still believe it and it's still true, but it's like running through the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You can do it and you know it. It's true. But if something is only degraded to the level of being memorized by rote, it doesn't have life anymore. And so what I would say is the things that matter the most to you, instead of hiding them away so that people won't disagree with you, you want to display them. You want to discuss them, not to yell at other people when they disagree, but to make that thing live in your heart and soul and mind ever more strongly and ever more alive every day. Should I drop the mic here? Is now the appropriate time to do that? That's why if something's a sacred cow for you, you don't want to hide it away. You want to share it, not necessarily to convert others, but to keep it alive in your own heart. You know, there's some traditions where if you don't say someone's name or remember them after they die, that they sort of disappear. I think someone told me in the movie Coco, I think it was, that something like this happens. And there's some forms of ancestor worship in different cultures where if you don't light candles and incense and remember the dead, that they sort of stop existing. Something like that is going on here for ideas. If you only say the memorized phrase, or you don't say it at all, you just keep it in your heart, it'll shrink every day. So the things that are most important to you, you should try to talk about them, whether with people who agree or disagree. But don't just know it, you have to talk about it. And that's what philosophy is the passionate drive to talk about everything, to try to know a little bit more about everything. But we can't actually drop the mic just yet, because I have a question that I want to ask you. The question is this. Mill says that everything, true or false, should be discussed in public. Mill says that everything, personal ideas, abstract ideas, all of it should be up for philosophical discussion. Do you think there are any ideas which should not be talked about in public? Okay, this is the discussion question for Mill today. What topics do you think should be silent? What topics, if any, do you think don't belong in public discussion? What should be kept private or not talked about? Okay. So as always, this is a discussion question. The recording is going to end when I'm done asking it, so you won't need to pause this time, but that's what I normally have you do, is take a moment to collect your thoughts. What topics, if any, do you think should stay private? What topics, if any, lack a place in the public sphere, should not be talked about in the public sphere? Okay, that's what I'd like you to answer now on the discussion board. Okay, thank you, everyone.